Leading the assault in the south, General Sir Bernard Montgomery was scheduled to slip across the strait with 2 British divisions and make the invasion of continental Europe an accomplished fact. The assault was to be launched from Messina, last enemy stronghold to fall in Sicily. During the first days of September, British Tommies went aboard ship in preparation for the landing only 6 miles away across the strait. The invading forces were 2 crack units, the 5th and Canadian Divisions of the British 8th Army. The moment when we would come to grips with the enemy on his home continent was at hand. In the hours just before dawn on September 3rd, the 4th anniversary of Britain's declaration of war, the assault wave set out. Just across the Strait of Messina on the Italian coast, the spearheads of the attacking force landed near Reggio Calabria against almost no resistance, and a 10-mile beachhead was quickly established. With their foothold on European soil made secure, Montgomery's men were now started on their job of forcing the enemy back without let-up. The entire stretch of Italian coast, bordering the Strait of Messina, on both sides of the landing beaches, was soon completely under Allied control. Montgomery immediately started an advance up the toe of the boot. His troops were carefully watched by the enemy, anxious to detect our major move. At Algiers in late May of 1943, the Allied High Command had weighed every consideration involved in the overall strategy of the invasion of Italy. A major factor was the possibility of an Italian surrender to coincide with our landings.
The Italians wanted frantically to surrender. However, they wanted the assurance that such a powerful Allied force would land on the mainland, that the government itself and their cities would enjoy complete protection.
Simultaneously with the hoped-for Italian surrender, the plan called for the Italian mainland to be invaded by Allied forces at 2 additional points. On the west coast at Salerno, British and American troops were to make the assault. At the same time, a smaller force of British troops was to land at Taranto in the arch of the boot. The negotiations for the Italian surrender dragged along, but finally word crossed the world that Italy had capitulated.
It was agreed that the surrender should become effective on the evening of September 8th. I chose that date because at midnight, our Salerno attack would begin.
In the Mediterranean in September 1943, the Italian fleet, still a powerful striking force consisting of more than 100 warships, was surrendered to the Allies. General Eisenhower himself reviewed the array of surrendered Italian war vessels, no longer a menace to our movement in the Mediterranean. As the day for the invasion of Salerno approached, convoys were crossing the Mediterranean from several directions. American troops had embarked on their transports at Oran in North Africa and Palermo in Sicily. British troops had boarded ship in Bizerte in Tripoli in North Africa. The American 5th Army, which was to make the Salerno assault, was commanded by Lieutenant General Mark Clark, General Eisenhower's former deputy, who was getting his first taste of action in World War II. En route to the point of attack, the invasion forces were given their final briefing. The last-minute preparations for battle followed a now familiar pattern. For hours on end, the men cleaned and checked their weapons, and then enjoyed their last chance to relax for some time to come.
All hands, man your battle stations! Man your battle stations!
With the landing still 12 hours away, some of the ships and the convoys were attacked by enemy planes, intent on beating off the invasion by sinking some of our vessels and their invaluable cargo of assault troops. But our Navy gun crews were equal to the challenge. By this time, with each hour drawing closer, our intentions were becoming clear to the enemy.
With the equivalent of 4 divisions in the assault, we were invading a country in which there were estimated to be 18 German divisions. Although follow-up troops would double the initial assault strength, in some respects, the operation looked foolhardy.
The Allied troops landed at dawn on September 9th along a 25-mile stretch south of Salerno. The Italians' surrender had little effect on the Nazis' stubborn resistance. For 2 weeks, the Germans had prepared defensive positions covering the beachhead, and the invading British and American troops had a tough time establishing a foothold.
The landing and succeeding operations developed almost identically to our intelligence predictions. It was a sharp but relatively short fight in getting ashore, and with minor exceptions, the details of the actual landing proceeded well.
By afternoon of the invasion day, the enemy's chance of annihilating our position was lessened considerably. But the enemy was not giving up that early. With every weapon at their disposal, the Germans, under the command of Field Marshal Albert Kesselring, kept pounding at the Allies' limited beachhead. Nazi reinforcements were brought up, and from the high ground inland, the Nazis still kept the beaches under constant fire.
On September 13th, the German attack struck in all its fury, and fierce fighting ensued for a considerable period. The German attack pushed forward to within 2 or 3 miles of the beach. The outlook became gloomy.
The battle for Salerno was bitterly contested. On our success in beating off the German counterattacks depended the whole future pattern of the war against Hitler. The Allies finally had a more secure beachhead after 7 days of intense fighting, but they paid a high price. Losses were heavy, hundreds of Allied dead and wounded, among the first of millions of casualties to be suffered by the Western Allies in capturing the Nazi fortress of Europe. The enemy still had to be driven back from the area surrounding the landing beaches. Allied warships played a major part in effecting the Nazi withdrawal. Allied bombers from North African bases continued the bombardment of the enemy's positions.
What's Bombay doing?
In one 24-hour period, 1,400 tons of bombs were dropped on the stubbornly resisting Nazis. The Allied forces were now in position for a general advance, which soon turned into a full-scale offensive. With the Fifth Army advancing steadily in all sectors of the front, the enemy was forced to fall back. The Nazi withdrawal, accompanied by only sporadic delaying action, enabled the Allies to consolidate their gains in the area surrounding Salerno. The long, arduous battle for Italy was now underway, a campaign which was to become known as one of the most exhausting major operations of the war. The Italian campaign was already proving extremely difficult on the tactical level. The natural terrain advantages which the Nazis enjoyed in their defensive role combined with the weather to make the job ahead an especially tough one for Allied commanders. Meanwhile, in the south, Montgomery was taking advantage of the Nazis' preoccupation with the Salerno assault to proceed quickly up the toe and shin of the boot. On September 16th, advance elements of the British Eighth Army met some of General Clark's Fifth Army troops south of Salerno, and the Allies had an effective hold on southern Italy. In his commander of the U.S. Fifth Army, General Eisenhower had complete confidence.
Clark was a relatively young man, but an extremely able professional, with a faculty for picking fine assistants and for developing a high morale within his staff. I gained a lasting respect for his planning, training, and organizing ability, which I have not seen excelled in any other officer. When General Clark led the Fifth Army into Salerno, he had not previously participated in any of the fighting of World War II. He proved to be a fine battle leader and fully justified the personal confidence that had impelled me to assign him to such an important position.
One of the most important prizes in our path in southern Italy was the enemy air base at Foggia. Encountering limited resistance, British troops captured that prize in late September. It placed important objectives from Germany to the Black Sea within range of our bombers and denied the enemy an important base from which to attack our advancing troops. To the north of Salerno, in the U.S. Fifth Army's path, lay Naples, which our forces entered triumphantly on October 1st, 1943. Naples had been one of the Nazis' principal port cities and marked a notable advance for the Allies on the road to Rome. When American troops entered the city, they found the remains of a legendary center of cultural life. In taking Naples, the Allies had been forced to bomb and shell the city severely. Whatever survived that assault had also to withstand the demolition set by the retreating Germans. Much of the damage to Naples was the work of the Germans. The city was subjected to as savage demolition and bombing as any other population center so far captured in Italy. Within the ruined city, the business of daily life was paralyzed. The Germans had been so thorough in sacking Naples that it was like a phantom city, dazed and silent. In the devastated city were nearly 1 million people who must be provided with at least the bare necessities of life. Most of the surviving Neapolitans were suffering acutely from thirst after the destruction by the fleeing Nazis of the city's water supply system. The urgent craving for water and food became the chief obsession of the people. The final German job of scuttling was a delayed operation. 13 days after they had evacuated the city, the post office blew up, following the explosion of a German time bomb. There were scores of casualties. The port facilities of Naples were a complete wreck. Ships had been sunk by the Germans to block the piers, so that when the Allies entered, there was not one full berth available. Other ships had been sunk to block channels. Retaining walls for some piers had been blown up. The port was completely unusable. But the port did not remain in that condition for long.
The combination of engineers and sea salvage experts who had constantly amazed us with their exploits in the rehabilitation of harbors immediately went to work. All of their prior successes at Casablanca, Algiers, Oran, Bizerta, and Palermo were as nothing compared to the speed and efficiency with which they repaired the seemingly destroyed and useless harbor facilities at Naples.
On October 10, 1943, only 10 days after the Allied liberation of Naples, the port was handling a tonnage equivalent to the peacetime capacity of 6,000 tons. On a single day, Naples port workers sometimes unloaded as much as 5 times the peacetime high. With the port repaired and once again in operation, desperately needed equipment and supplies were brought in to bring some relief to the stricken city. Through the Allied military government, the food so vitally needed to prevent wholesale starvation was quickly made available to the Italian people. For many inhabitants, the Allied liberation came just in time. After months of malnutrition, Neapolitans could look forward to eating regularly again. Slowly, Naples was rising again from its ruins. Under the guidance of American military officials, Italian workmen set eagerly about the task of rebuilding their historic city. During the first month after the liberation, electric power was restored. With its public utilities functioning, life began again for the 800,000 Neapolitans who had lived through the ordeal of Nazi occupation.
While the summer and fall fighting was in full swing, we received word that President Roosevelt and Prime Minister Churchill and their staffs were preparing to hold another joint meeting, this time near Cairo. It appeared to me and to my associates at the Cairo conference that the British still favored a vigorous and all-out prosecution of the Mediterranean campaign, even, if necessary, at the expense of additional delay in launching the cross-channel invasion, while the Americans declined to approve anything that would detract from the strength of the attack to be delivered across the channel early in the following summer.
In Sicily, after the conference, General Eisenhower had the opportunity to renew private talks with the president.
His conversation revolved more around post-war problems than those of immediate operations. He gave me his ideas on the post-hostilities occupation of Germany and listened sympathetically to my contention that occupation should become a responsibility of civil agencies of government as soon as the exigencies of war might permit. He mentioned domestic politics only to say that much as he'd like to go back to private life, it looked as if he'd have to stand again for the presidency.